Next, please welcome David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm a great admirer of the Chicago Council and of the Financial Times and of mayors around the world who are defying the toxicity of the refugee and asylum issue to bring positive solutions. And so I'm very grateful for the chance to talk to you today. I think that if we'd been meeting even 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, the idea of the leader of a humanitarian agency coming to speak to a conference of cities would have seemed somewhat out of place. The image was that humanitarians worked in refugee camps, they were far away from city centers, and the truth is we're living in a new world. It's first of all the case, cities are actually the center of conflict today. It's not what I'm going to spend my time talking about, but in Idlib or Aleppo or in Hodeidah today, it's cities that are the center of the civil wars that are generating refugees around the world. And I think it's worth remembering that that's the front line in the burgeoning number of civil conflicts that are happening around the world. But secondly, the second reason for being here is that cities are in the front line of coping with the flow of refugees and asylum seekers and also of the internally displaced. I run an international humanitarian aid organization that's also a refugee resettlement agency here in the United States. What we know is that 60% of the world's refugees are now living in urban areas, not in camps, and 80% of the world's internally displaced people are living in cities, not in camps. So if you take the example of Syria, it was a country of 23 million people, 6 million refugees in neighboring states, as well as some in Europe, 8 million internally displaced. It's cities that are at the absolute center of that policy and political challenge. In terms of numbers, just to situate this, there are about 28.5 million refugees and asylum seekers around the world today. That means if you quickly do the maths, you'll see you're talking 16, 17 million refugees and asylum seekers in cities today. The number of internally displaced is about 40 million. So 80% of that, you're talking of upwards of 30 million internally displaced people in cities. These are all people fleeing from war and persecution and disaster, separate from economic migrants, which we'll talk a bit about in the session that is ahead. My organization has experience of resettling about 390,000 new Americans over the last 40 years in 25 cities across the country. And we're using that experience to become more globally focused, working in Germany, Argentina, elsewhere, to help cities above all, not just cope, but make the most of the new influx of people who are coming to them week after week. And I just want to pick out what I think are some important lessons of this. The first lesson is a very simple one. It's to say thank you to the mayors here who are defying an increasingly toxic political environment, which I'll say a little bit about, to bring practical solutions to what can seem like a very, very large problem. You'd think from the media that most refugees and asylum seekers are in developed and wealthy countries. That's not the case. 8% of the world's refugees are in Europe, 2% are in the United States, 86% are in low or middle income or lower middle income countries around the world. So as well as saying thank you to the mayors of Dallas or Houston who are defying state authority in this country to say that refugees are an asset, it's also very important to say that the mayors of Amman, the mayors of Nairobi, the mayor of Maiduguri in northeastern Nigeria, they are coping with the largest numbers of people, and they're obviously doing so with the fewest resources. What I want to talk about today is how there are some lessons that apply not just in the industrialized world, but also in some of those fragile contexts around the world. The second thing I just want to highlight is that you'll often hear people talking, you can even see this in UN documents, there's discussion of the quote-unquote burden that refugees or the internally displaced represents. And this raises a really important issue of mindset. One of the things that strikes me just preparing for this meeting, looking at what's being done by the cities that are represented here, there's a distinctive determination to see the people who are arriving as assets to communities, to cities, not simply as a burden. I'm struck that where we work, you'll hear from the Deputy Mayor of Athens, but also where we work across the US and where we work in fragile and developing contexts, there is a coalition for city renewal, which when led by mayors with an open-minded attitude, says that people who are arriving as refugees or asylum seekers are part of that coalition for renewal, and they become net contributors. And all of the microeconomic data that we have, mainly from the US, but not only from the US, is that these people pay much more in taxes than they receive in benefits within 5 years. So these are net contributors to the local economy rather than a drain on the local economy. Third thing I just want to pick out are some of the policy lessons from the work that we've been doing in the US and around the world. The first is an obvious one. Cash is the main thing that refugees lack. And cash is an obvious way for them to be bringing back into the local community. We did a study in Lebanon, which showed that for every $100 that you gave to a refugee, $213 circulated in the local economy. And we've adopted the position in the International Rescue Committee that why not cash is the first question we ask before we start delivering services. Second point, the US experience is that employment is the great integrator as well as the great chance to give people an independent means of living. And we're very clear that the sort of successes we've had in our employment programs can be replicated elsewhere. We get about 80% of heads of households who inscribe in our employment programs into work within 6 months. We're working with, for example, Intel across Germany to hire 1,000 refugees to give them the chance to not just earn a living, but to integrate. Half of the world's refugees and displaced people are children, and so education is the second absolutely vital part of a successful refugee response policy. It's one of the hardest things to do. The best experience we have is where the formal system is expanded, including things like the double shift in Lebanon or in Jordan, but also where community-based education is side by side, often helping children overcome the toxic stress, the trauma they've been through before they enter the mainstream schooling system. I won't talk about housing because you'll hear a bit more about that from the Deputy Mayor of Athens, but that's obviously key to success. Fourth point I just want to make, it's a really important principle for us in the services that we deliver, that we remember that while refugees are new arrivals, there's huge needs amongst host populations. We say that every service we offer, an employment service, a health service, help for kids, has got to be open to the host population as well as to the arrivals. And we're very conscious of the danger that you get tension between host populations and those who are arriving. I think it's really important that we as an NGO take on the point that we can't have segregated services. And if you go to see our work north of Beirut, where we're running an employment center, you've got Lebanese side by side with Syrian. Actually, it's a women's employment center, which is trying to invest both in Syrian women and in Lebanese women to give them the chance to get on the road to independence. Final point that I hope we can use today to discuss is how the work that you're undertaking can have a louder voice in your own home countries where public opinion can be polarized, but also greater voice around the international tables. I was speaking to Mayor Rees of Bristol earlier about the Mayor's Forum on Migration, and I think they could be a really important voice in a debate that too often is stuck between donor governments on the one hand, multilateral agencies on the other. They need the spur that I think can come from the city level. I just want to finish up on the following point. You'll hear people say that modern politics is less left versus right and more about open versus closed. And I think there's something in that. The cities that I see represented here have clearly chosen openness and connectivity as central to their prosperity and to their security. But I want to put to you that the refugee and displacement issue raises a different polarization. And that is between demonization on the one hand and humanization on the other. We know about the demonization of many people who are fleeing for their lives from war zones around the world. The biggest challenge we face is that they are in the process dehumanized. And I think the work that we're doing with cities around the world, that other NGOs are doing as well, is actually humanizing this population, giving them voice, and showing that far from being a statistic or a burden, they can actually be contributors to a healthy and thriving community. If we can take that spirit into the discussion, then I think we'll have a good next 40 minutes. Thank you very much indeed for listening.